panel is we're going to let the plants talk because we are trying to obviously foster a better stewardship of our environment, and that has a big impact on how we construct things, and being more mindful of the practices that we have, both from an architecture standpoint and a construction standpoint, on our land and the future of it. So I assembled I would say an eclectic group coming from different backgrounds, but for that it makes it to me more interesting and more challenging to get a discussion on this. So we have Josiah Clark. Well, first of all, Karen Curtis. So I'll let you introduce each of you. You're up first since your slide's up first. Introduce. We have architecture, construction, and landscape represented here. So we'll see how this goes. Go ahead, Karen. Tell them who you are.
Hi. So I'm an architect, and I've also recently become a farmer, because I think all architects maybe need to be farmers, in a very basic sense, that when you are making architecture, we all think of this beautiful act of creation, but actually making is taking. So it's an act of taking a tree. It's an act of taking straw to make a straw bell wall. It's an act of taking something from a quarry or a mine. It's an act of taking clay from the soil. All those things are what creation is. And so that is why I'm both a farmer and an architect.
That's great. Okay, Jeff.
I'm the principal of Red Dot Studios.
Yeah.
Josiah, you want to next? Okay. My name is Jeff King. I am the president of Jeff King & Company. We're building contractors based here in San Francisco, but we work all over the Bay Area, in the East Bay and North Bay. We primarily focus on residential construction. And we try to approach it in as a sustainable fashion as we can. I'll talk about that more as we're in our discussion here today. But given the nature of our clients, that's always a little bit of a customized specifically to whoever it is who is our client at that time. But yeah.
So my name is Josiah Clark. I run a company called Habitat Potential, and I work with a lot of government contracts, but also a lot of residential and homeowners associations. So I get to see projects from the very beginning stages all the way through the end. And I would think that I was really trying to put my finger on what it is that I can really bring to something like this. And the concept is I've heard people talking about mindfulness, and I think one of the parts of mindfulness is noticing. And I was hearing something on a TED Talk about how they were going back and looking at the most successful companies, and they were realizing a lot of it came down to noticers. And noticers might not be the best planners, or they might not be the best communicators, or they might not be the best, but they are often people who are noticing things that other people aren't. And as someone who carries binoculars to this thing, because and as someone who just came out of the field earlier today, I can tell you that my job is really to not passive, just seeing, but actively looking. And this, so I would say if you ever want somebody who's, look for someone who looks at plants, looks at birds, a farmer, something like that, a fisherman, people who have to actively take in what's happening in their environment. I believe if we brought that onto job sites from the beginning through the end, especially having these noticers who are noticing things maybe that other people aren't in the very beginning stages, that's really what I would give a plug to. And I'm a consulting ecologist for the city. I've been working with Rec Park and various agencies a long time.
Great. I think I'm going to lob the next one to Jeff, because Jeff, you're a contractor, construction. Do you notice things on the construction site that other people don't notice? How do you...
Well, I like Josiah's concept of noticing. As Mary Oliver likes to say in her poetry, it's paying attention, right? So paying attention, I think, is one of the greatest human traits, curiosity being maybe right before that. Definitely. I mean, I think being really good on the build side requires that we're paying really close attention. Not only do we have to know what the design intent is that is coming from the design team, but we really need to know what our clients have hired us for. Some of those things are implicit. It's some sort of construction, some sort of new home, some sort of renovation, whatever that is. Those things are implicit, but there's a lot of things that are not always said and made explicit as a part of that. And so I think paying attention, having really deep dialogues, not only with the homeowners, but sometimes the consultants, or sometimes the people who are not saying as much during those dialogues are the people who are saying something too. So I think paying attention is a really important part of what we do as the builders, so that we can, on the build side, make sure that we are honoring whatever those intents are. So yeah.
And do no harm, right?
And do no harm. Yeah.
Karen, so what does it mean to design for humans and non-humans? And, what's that relationship between the urban and the rural parts of your projects?
So I think one thing that Jeff just mentioned is like designing for your clients. And if you can simply just realize that it's not just the people who are in front of you. So your clients expand out to that, and that actually all of our actions end up being interconnected. We're knowing this more and more through globalization, but when we're making decisions on a site, or decisions about where we site something, we can be putting a building where, say, like the best pasture grass is, or we can be putting a building where the eucalyptus trees kind of need it to come down to allow a new forest to go. So there's other factors, there's other clients. We're all interrelated to each other, so our clients go beyond the humans that have hired us, because then essentially at some point, the earth is our client too. So I can come back to bioregionalism later, because that was enough of an answer.
Yeah, that's great. Josiah, there must be people here from the Bay Area, so I'd love for you to tell us about some of your more notable projects in San Francisco.
Yeah,
And some of the challenges you've
sure.
had working with all the stakeholders on a project.
Yeah. I just have to say that I had to just hold my tongue for a minute, because it's so much what I say is our first client is really nature in Habitat Potential. And that is thankfully in an age where we have, right, I mean, let's look at really where we are. We're one of the most affluent areas of the world, and we're in one of the areas that kind of development, as far as moving east to west, we got here last. And it meant that we didn't screw it all up as bad. And it meant that we had people like John McLaren and some of these other real visionaries who took pieces of land that otherwise might have ended up as, ticky-tacky, really not so cool suburban sprawl that really leads to that kind of cultural void. I'll say I was at the Shoreline last night, and the amphitheater, and comparing it to like the kind of nooks and crannies of musical interest that happen here in the city. I mean, it's just an example of, I guess people know what they like here, and luckily they like their parks. We have a lot of parks. I get to work with, all different levels of kind of the food chain and the totem pole, from the national park, the state parks, the city parks, and then nonprofit and friends of support groups. So some of the cool ones I'm working on now are out on Yerba Buena Island, where I manage the natural resources through Treasure Island Development Authority, and in direct conjunction with the biodiversity coordinator for the city, who's Peter Brastow, and runs this great organization, Nature in the City, which is kind of the nonprofit arm of some of these things that happen. There's Middle Lake in Golden Gate Park. If you haven't seen Middle Lake, it's just newly open to the public. It's along Chain of Lakes Drive. It's one of the 3 lakes. It's the first lake in Golden Gate Park to be all redone with native plants. And it's amazing how much a project done successfully. I also worked on Chrissy Field right down here in the very beginning, and got to the whole Grow Chrissy Field campaign, which was really one of the inspirations for Habitat Potential in being the kind of thing. We saw how much the public wanted to be involved, how much the public, the input, and there were a lot of public meetings. I mean, I could go on and on about it, but there's right here, there's cool things happening just down the hill. There's the park right across the street, Francisco Park, which was like an old one. I mean, and if anyone has any questions about parks, maybe I could guide it in that direction, but.
Great. Jeff, so when you're looking at challenges that come up when a client is, wanting to expand their house on the existing land. Tell us about some of the things that you employ with your workforce to be, better stewards of the property, and how does it interface with, water systems, soil management. Give us some practical tips. There's designers here that have been, craving for how to talk to their own contractors about doing better on a construction site.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it's incredibly hard, first of all, to make sure that, if you have a project that's 12 months or 24 months or 36 months long, to maintain good stewardship throughout the entire length of that project. You have literally hundreds of people coming through a project site from the beginning all the way to the end, and it really can be a challenge to keep each one of those people sort of in alignment with whatever the philosophy or whatever the just basic demands are of the project site. So the first thing is obviously set up really good areas for staging. So if you're staging materials, make sure you have your staging areas kind of clarified and zoned off. Actually, the very first thing you need to do is make sure that the specimen plants and or trees on the site are protected, and then soil erosion is protected. Putting out the proper SWIP measures, putting in a good washout area. That's a really huge thing, because a lot of people, first thing we do is we go in and cut off all the infrastructure for the project. We have to bring in portable toilets and some portable sinks, and then we might have a hose bib and a sink, and lesser job sites might dig a hole and throw some sand in it and let it the washout go into the ground. We try really hard not to do that. We try to make some kind of a physical connection to the sewer system, put in some washout filtration systems, and have a washout sink there for the duration of the project. That's a really big piece to really protect the landscape. Of course, during the construction side of things, the deconstruction side of things and the demolition side of things, just protecting the soil and the landscape around, for all that debris, particularly hazardous waste, the lead, paints, those kinds of things that are coming off of the building, making sure those are falling into some kind of containment system so that we can then get that properly taken off to the disposal containers. But that stuff is kind of ongoing. So even though, now the lead paint's gone off the site because you've completely demolished the exterior of the building, and now you are bringing in, whatever the other layers are of construction, you still need to protect that site, because there's lots of stuff that's dropping off the ladders, whether it's screws or whether it's pieces of wire or pieces of plastic from the rain screens or whatever that is, little bits of waterproofing measures, and just constantly keeping sort of a clean approach to the job site. A lot of that is really on the burden of the general contractor, whose site supervisors out on site kind of acting as policemen. There's a lot of things he has to do, but that is one of the things that he has to do, is be the policeman and educate the people on site. Like, this is where we're doing our washout. This is where we're storing our materials. Here's where you need to take all of your debris. Here's where the hazardous waste needs to go versus the things that are getting recycled. So it's an education process, and the longer the project, the harder that really is.
Oh, why is that?
Well, because of the more people you've got coming through the project site, right? So you literally have hundreds and hundreds of people coming through the job site.
Right.
And so if you're not just vigilant about constantly showing people that, and a lot of times too, your staging area might have to move because now you've built something on that staging area, or your debris collection area might have to move 2 or 3 times. And so just kind of constantly educating people, making sure that when you do move the debris collection area, that it's still protecting the soil underneath it, and that people know that now, we're now in a new location. It's just vigilance, and it's a real problem for sure.
Yeah. Karen, do you want to?
I would just say to level out the playing field, because it's great when you're working with someone like Jeff and it's embedded in. But if you have the opportunity and you're writing the specs, you put that into your Division 1 specs so that it's there, and then everybody bidding is taking those same precautions. And this beautiful thing that happens during bidding. Everyone's excited to get the job, so they all say yes to it, right? And it makes it easier to make that happen if you've written it in. And you can write it in on residential scale for sure. And you can even write it in on residential scale that's not like over $1 million. It can happen because in fact, when it's smaller, sometimes you actually it's easier. It's harder when it gets bigger and there's more people coming on site. So it's not really an excuse to say you can't write it in for a smaller project. You actually kind of actually can. So just try it and see what happens.
So when you said the thing about writing it in, it made me think, what about having an actual little poster with like, here's the rules of the job site? Because that policeman only has as much bandwidth and as many eyes as they have. And I know this is managing a crew. And sometimes it's like you need to make sure that message is really disseminated and maybe obvious. And I mean, I deal with all kinds of contractors. I mean, some of the highest end contractors, I think, from the city, and I'm shocked that they can't keep their trash together. They can't even put things in a trash can. And you know, they put their weeds on the ground, or their stuff on the ground, and all the weeds grow through it over the course of the season. It's kind of like, who didn't think about that? And so I think it's being proactive. But one thing about being a noticer is then, I call it the crystal ball effect. It's like, if you see something happening like this now, what's it going to be like certain stages down? As those more and more people, right? In the beginning, you had the one contractor, and then you have two, and then you have three, then you have the other people. Those people weren't there last week, so even if they have the best intentions and they don't know, they're likely to do something wrong. I think of like almost like a campground or a music festival. That's like what you want to be obvious. Like, here's the recycling, and there's the bathroom, and there's the sink. Because otherwise people might do really weird stuff.
But there's
Guarantee that they will. I guarantee that they will. So that's what I'm saying.
And if it's not told to them explicitly, they have a reason to do weird stuff, right? I mean, you have to tell them in the beginning, hey, these are the rules, these are the expectations. But funny, most people think their expectation on a job site is just to get the job done. They don't think it's about keeping it clean.
Mm-hmm. But that comes from a mindset in architecture where you think you treat the ground like a piece of paper or a pixel on a screen. And actually the soil, the ground, the siting becomes very important. So if you've imbued that as a value, and it's a value that you've been talking about with your client, and it's a value you start talking about when you're interviewing contractors, what's happening is that that's something that's easier to transmit. You're talking about weeds coming through. That's because the ground is a piece of paper. The ground doesn't exist, soil doesn't exist. It's all just a site to do your vision. And if you have a little humility about what architecture is and what the built environment is, it's not our vision. We're creatures too. We're animals too, right? So what we are making is part of this earth and part of that site. And if you can treat it as if it's not just something, the site as something that we didn't create, but that we are getting to interplay with or use or be part of, then you have a different value, and then you're not like surprised about weeds. Like, of course, they're not weeds, they're plants, things grow. That's what happens in soil.
Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's all very relevant. Was that a question or just a comment? No, I
I'm
think
just
that
saying.
I think that all makes sense. I think that being able to be proactive and notice and look down the road and then have the action items. I mean, especially things like when it's going to rain. You know, like there needs to be like a very specific plan for when it's going to rain.
Next Tuesday and Wednesday, it's supposed to rain.
Right.
I already know that.
Well, on a lot of job sites, it's like that. Those kind of things are forgotten about, and all of a sudden, the piles of trash are then full of mud, and then all the weeds are growing through it.
So while we're on the topic of soil, and we'll get to water too, we have another speaker this afternoon. We'll talk more about that. So tell us about soil. We went in our discussion. Soil is a partner in the project, and all of you can relate to this. What destroys it? Why do we want to protect it? And keeping sites clean and personal, we've talked about that a bit, but talk about the first 2 points. What destroys it and why do we want to protect it?
So basically, we were all talking about carbon, and soil is actually holding a lot of the earth's carbon, and we're losing the topsoil. So a lot of that's actually happening through agriculture as well as construction. So that's why, like, you know, I like to eat and I like to live in shelters. So those top 2 things that I do cause a lot of environmental degradation, and not other animals do that. So we can figure that out differently. So as we want to think about topsoil and that nutrient-rich soil, we also need to be considering what's happening with washout and with erosion. And then we need to be looking at what we're putting into it. So I think one of the hardest things for me personally in construction right now is the waterproofing. You know, we think of materials, so I'm looking at what's going to leach into the soil with how we're making things. And we think of I'm going to go kind of wide here, but we think of building as a commodity, especially in our environment where we live. Buildings are so expensive, and we've been talking about the 1%, and we've been talking about these things, and we actually need to realize that there's some equity in how we're making this, and that we think of a building as holding this pot of money that we just put into it, and that it should just hold it and be like that forever and never change, and we will do no maintenance and nothing will ever harm it. And I think of like what makes that happen is forever chemicals, and we don't really like them in any other aspect of our life, but we love to put them all around our buildings and have them leach into the soil. So, and it turns out that the things that are, we heard earlier today, the things that are most carbon beneficial in terms of embodied carbon are also the most, have like the most justice orientation and also the best things for the soil. And so maybe there's just a change in a culture of care, that there is maybe the need for some maintenance and to use something that requires maintenance sometime instead of always just like coating it with PFAS, because, would we want that in our food? No, and we do. So that was a long-winded answer, and I'm going to let you go with it.
Well, I would say that, again, if we're kind of noticing and looking down the road, it's about seeing what activities do we have that are the inputs that are putting in these things. And of course, when we talk about soil, we're talking about so many things, and we're talking about, so many of the plants that, what I think about is like, well, there's mineral-based soils, and there's really organic-based soils, and there's sandy soils. They're all important. They all have the things that are good about them. What, of course, we have also a lot of our disturbed soils. Disturbed soils often talks about the strata, the fact that it's been all kind of mixed up, and that's, of course, like when we plow the land, there's a lot of things that happen. One, we lose a lot of carbon. But another thing that happens is we mix up all of the seed bank. So you're taking, what would be like the bunch grasses and the acorns and things that would be on the surface, and you're putting them underneath, and then you're mixing in all the things like star thistle and brassicas and all the things you don't want. And those end up coming up because the soil's really disturbed. And they are basically plants that have evolved to follow the plow. And they are kind of like the super tramps of the world, like these invasive plants that follow around the world in behind the oxen and the plow and the bulldozer. And they're getting around the world. At Middle Lake the other day, we had plants from 6 continents.
Wow.
Invasive plants from 6 continents, over like 60 species of weeds. So, that's our seed bank. I guess there's so many things I could say, but I think it's somewhere along the line we have to talk about this very real thing of lost in translation, which can happen literally with a language or figuratively, about this concept of, is it soil or is it dirt? Is this the place that we want to really preserve, or is this where you throw your stuff? And I think you can be very high up in the world or very low down in the world and have a very different perception. You can be somebody who loves whole foods because it's organic and it's pure soil, or you can be someone who is an indigenous person and really understands what it is to compost. But, we have a lot of people who work in this business who are the real backbone of our labor, who don't have the same type. They follow our lead. And if what they see is we throw our crap all over the ground, that's probably what they're going to do. And if they see that we use all kinds of chemicals and we don't want anything to do with them, well, we throw in the bushes and no one's going to know. So there needs to be this whole very real education and talking about letting people know, like, hey, we care in their own language, and on whatever language or cultural platform it is, we need to be able to communicate to these people that this is something important.
So on that topic of education, Jeff, tell us about some of the ways you've had to educate or like to educate either your clients or maybe your architect that you're working with about material selection, because you have experience with how things weather on the outside, or things like that you had mentioned in our talk before.
Yeah, sure. I think that, our opportunity on the build side, when we're working with great architects, it's a fairly easy dialogue to have. I think our biggest challenges are really just educating our clients, and that starts with us talking to them and listening to them and finding out what's really important to them, and hopefully the design team and us are coming to the same kind of place of understanding of what it is our clients really want. And, you know, our opportunity, I always try to kind of think about, rather than talking about sustainability or green building or anything like that, I always try to talk to the clients about the things that really nobody in the world doesn't care about, which is health, comfort, resource efficiency, and durability. When it comes to the construction side of things, there's nobody who doesn't care about that. And so really it's the level of what you're talking about. So
And reframing it.
and
ensure
it's a way to
alignment
reframe it
values.
so that there isn't, you know, the wealthiest of wealthy clients, the 1% of the 1%, which occasionally are our clients, you know, don't really care about sustainability, frankly. They wouldn't have 5 houses if they did, right? But you can do right by that piece of construction, whether they continue to own it or somebody else does in the future, just by talking to them about those 4 elements, and within those 4 elements, you know, of health, comfort, resource efficiency, and durability, you're going to come out with a really great product. So to your question, which is about materials, you know, we do want to make sure, particularly the exterior of a building, that it's incredibly durable, right? And that it doesn't need to Karen's point, doesn't need to be slathered up with a lot of maintenance through toxic chemicals and things like that will, you
Get
know,
in the soil.
makes it look a particular way all the time. That's a very hard thing to do. You want things that are more living finishes, you know, stuccos with integral pigments or natural woods or you know, things that resilient metals, coppers or stainless steels, things like that will hold up to the test of time and not really require a ton of maintenance. There are some really great sustainable, you know, Ipe for a long time, the ironwood, as its more common name, was really popular for a while, and you could get it, you know, harvested sustainably through chain of command, et cetera, the FSC certification process. But it's not really available any longer. But you know, decking is still a really prominent piece of a construction project. And you know, what do we use now? So there's a few really good products out there, and there's one that I mentioned the other day when we were talking, called Moso, which is a bamboo decking that looks just like Ipe. It's completely great, and it's a sustainable product and has a really great lifetime warranty on it. And so sometimes we're able to bring those things to the table and have an opportunity to kind of push the needle a little bit. But more than anything, we really try to make sure that what we're building is going to stand up to the test of time. That's where we have our opportunity, right, to make an impact.
Can I piggyback on Ipe? Because I think you just said you used to be able to get it FSC certified. So like, I remember in the late 90s, early 2000s, Ipe was like an environmental wonder, because what it was doing, it was a tree in the rainforest that previously had no value, and now it had value. So now we have this, and before they would just clear cut it and use the area for cattle, because that had economic value. And then Ipe came on the market, and we're like, hey, now we have a tree that has economic value, so the forest won't be clear cut anymore. Well, see, the story didn't change at all. They're like, oh, this is. See, that's what happened. The story didn't change at all. See, there was no change of thought process. The change was, oh, this is economic value? Let's clear cut for this. So now Ipe is no longer sustainable. So if we want to get back to this concept of storytelling, it's integral to how we're going to think about this change. It's like storytelling the site is not a piece of paper. I listened to Jonathan Cordero from the Ramatuja Ohlone speak a number of times, and he's like, figure out what your own origin story is, don't take ours, but like listen to what your origin story is telling you, and it may be telling you why you act a certain way, right? So so maybe the origin story didn't need to be about Dominion. Maybe we can go back a little further in history and have it be about something else. And then Ipe can go back to being a sustainable wood, because there's a value, and it's a sustainably managed value, and it's not a clear-cut forest.
You guys were talking earlier about soil, and I actually wanted to get back to one more thing. Karen, I might have to have you pick this back up. About the types of soil. You were saying some is good and has beautiful plants, and some not so good. So does that affect the way you site a home?
Oh, for sure. So it depends on where you're building, and there's just sometimes if you're in an urban environment and you're on a lot and it has like a 40% slope filled with fill, you're going to be building on bad soil. Like that's the lot that you have. And so I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, we've never done a house like that. We've done a house like that, you know. I just finished another one. But that is incredibly intensive to then put that foundation system in. So then you get to another spot where you maybe have more room to look, and you can look you can look at the site, and it's obvious. I mean, we all do if you're an architect in the room, you're going to do a geotech report or a geologist report. You're going to know what the bearing capacity of your soil is. But in the end, we sometimes, and I've done it too, so I'm not going to be holier than thou. I've got some very big buildings, some very small buildings, some places that were very high end, some places that were like doing everything that I'm saying I want to do, and then we still fail, right? You know, so we still make mistakes and learn on the process. But if you're able to, it's basic, like looking at daylight, to look at what the ground is doing. It also is basic to look at what the plants are doing, what the tree cover is doing. And all of that's kind of written in some ways. There's WUI codes for wildlife-urban interfaces. There's codes about what has to happen for the bearing, like what your foundation needs to be. There's codes about what happens for energy consumption based on where your windows are. So all of those things are sort of there and available to us as tools, and they're actually part of like the things we bring to the table while siting. So if you have an opportunity and you're siting a building and you think, oh my gosh, that is a great view, I'm going to perch the building over that hill so I can be cantilevered into the view, you're going to be disturbing more than if you set it back, you know? So it's like kind of, if your client and the planet are your customers, then you're making different decisions. And if your client knows that, then they're right along with you making that decision.
And is it your responsibility to try to bring them into that conversation in that way that you just so elegantly put, pointing out the differences in option A or option B?
You will need to use in your practice the tool that works best for you.
You just guilt trip them, right?
No, I mean, for me, it's storytelling about who they are and what they want to be, right? That's what works for me. For other people, they want to hear the facts and the knowledge and the like real cost implications of plan A versus plan B. Some of those are, for me, sometimes that seems obvious to me. So I'm like, you really want me to cost out a cantilevered pier system versus building on a mat slab or footings or something over here? Okay. So you have a good way of it. You've actually taught me stuff on projects, by the way.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
Share some of those secrets
Yeah,
of
you have to tell me what they are. I'm
talking
not
to
sure.
clients, because if that is part of the
Well,
barrier.
like I was saying earlier, I think that you have to speak a language that everybody buys into. And as I said, I fell back to boiling it down to those four things I mentioned before, which is health, comfort, resource efficiency, and durability. You can wrap every bit of a building's discussion into those four things, and you will find that everybody relates to those in some facet or other. And so the things that you're speaking about, you know, a cantilevered structure that has, you know, a crazy architectural kind of statement to it versus one that's back here, maybe it's a little harder to wrap it into those four pieces. The resource efficiency, for sure, you could talk about it there, but someone has to care about that, right? So
How do you
you're
get them
trying
to
to
care?
appeal to how they care. How do you get them to care about those things? And so, you know, for me, I'm on the tail end of that, so I'm pushing mostly on systems and waterproofing and the infrastructure for the house wraps, all those things that are going to make the house last 25 years or, you know, 125 years, right? Those are the things that I'm trying to push on. And I obviously also budget balances in there too. There's a lot of factors that go into those dialogues, but trying to get the person to be engaged, you just have to test it out. But my guess is that when someone comes and hires Karen and or me, they're already coming to us because we've put some of that information or kind of energy, if you will, out there, and they're hiring us for that, right? So the dialogue is a little bit easier. Plus, as someone was saying earlier, we live in an incredibly, I think it was Jim Slater, we live in an incredibly progressive space here in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, so we have people who are already thinking a lot about those things to begin with, which is helpful.
Yeah, so something that came up in our conversations earlier is, and this is what you're talking about, Karen, is treating nature as a design partner. And I just love that philosophy. And Josiah, I want you to sort of talk about that because, you know, when you approach a property, whether it's a public park or a private home, you know, how much are you considering not just the soil, but the critters, the birds, the migration patterns, et
Right. Well,
cetera?
something I was going to say, which is relevant to this and to what you were saying, to what you both were saying, and it actually comes down to stuff that happened right here in the Presidio, which I don't know if any of you all went to the community meetings for the Presidio Trust. But, you know, there were all these different people in there, probably like there are when it's how are you going to design, and everybody's chiming in on what are you going to do and why are you going to do it or what aren't you going to do. And, of course, a lot of the stuff here was how much of the Presidio were they going to save, how much were they going to develop, how much native plants were they going to have, how many trees were they going to cut down. And when they talked to, you know, I remember after all the decisions were made and we were saying, yay, oh my gosh, I can't believe that they're really going to like really carry this ball forward on like really putting their money where their mouth is on like native plant communities and restoration and all of this. And they went and talked to these people on the Presidio Trust afterwards and they said, like, well, what was it? Why did you do that? And they said it was some of the people who came up from the community and they looked them in the eye up there and they said, this is your legacy. And that's what a building is also. That building is like the root that you're putting down into the ground. And when you put that thing in there, it's not going away. And if you put it in there like some selfish a-hole, that's going to be your legacy. And maybe they just don't care. But I think that there are people who care, and I think that you want to work towards the people who care. So how do you make the decisions you're going to make? I mean, there's who are our clients? And a big buzzword in that is biodiversity, right? And we, of course, talk about E.O. Wilson. E.O. Wilson is the guy who talks all about, you know, global biodiversity hotspots and how the San Francisco Floristic Province is one, and or the Franciscan Floristic Province. So how do you make decisions? It really comes down to the Nature Conservancy's mantra of, you know, it's like that thing of like, where do you even start cleaning up your room? Like, what do you even do? And the thing is, well, you want to start with the last of the least and the best of the rest. And you got to think about what that really means. The last of the least is like the rarest, most endangered San Francisco Lysingyias and Suedas californicas, and the last species that exist, mission blue butterflies that exist nowhere else. Those are the, and then the last of the least, and the best of the rest is, well, it's your woods. It's not just any old redwoods. You know, it's Avenue of the Giants. You know, and you go and you preserve the best of what there is. And that happens at all these different scales, right? That could happen on the scale of the city or the Bay Area or a building site. And how do you manage this? And so much of this, again, I will just give a plug to bringing a real ecologist onto your building site early in the game. Don't wait until it's landscaping time to have an ecologist, because you probably already did something. Like when I was working on Treasure Island, you know, and I'm out there working with natural resources, and I started talking to the people way up there who were doing the big stuff. They're like, gosh, I wish I had heard this earlier. We would have designed like the whole shoreline differently. So
thus our point of putting this type of panel together is that the need for people from different disciplines to talk to each other because of what we learn before we start designing, before we've lifted a hammer. So
How do you get a consulting biologist on a project of what scales? I'm seriously, like, how do you get it? How do you get it on projects of smaller scales? Because it's usually
I
no. I'm
personally?
just like, how do you show up on a project of a smaller
do
scale?
I show up
Yeah. Is it
personally?
usually regulatory?
I've been very lucky.
Or is it-
Okay, so there's, you know, I've worked my way up the food chain. And you know, you eventually get. It's okay. A lot of the gatekeepers are natural resource managers in the city. So this is a case where it's one thing that I also bring is getting to work not just you know a private company that's kind of a free for all of what the process is going to be and how are people going to duke out and delegate the power and all that. I work with an organization that has been doing this for a long time, and they've gotten better and better at it. You know, and Rec Park gets a lot of flack, but the truth is they are making progress. They've got legs, and they are, and so does the Presidio. in the National Park Service. So what you see is you take those, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. You take the models that work and you work with that. So what was the specific question? Was that
I
it?
guess I have a question. On private land, the only time that I've been able to bring a consulting biologist on is when it's regulated.
Right.
So
You
how
gotta
do we change, like what do we do in this
You
room?
got to tell them that it's
I'm
more
asking you.
expensive not to bring them on early.
All right, avoid
You know,
mistakes.
Okay.
a lot of times, yeah, is it expensive to bring a biologist? Yeah. But you know what? You'll pay more if you don't have that. And you don't want necessarily the regulatory biologist as your
Correct.
first one.
Yeah.
You want the one that's going to tell you what it is. It's not going to force you to do anything. They're going to inform you. And they're going to tell you the best case scenario. Because the truth is, okay, you know who regulatory, you know what we call regulatory? We call them biologists, we call them biostitutes. There's a serious biostitution problem in the Bay Area. And that's why I started Habitat Potential. And thankfully, people have now worked their way, that there's people who actively want us there. And that starts with getting vetted by groups like the city and Treasure Island Development Authority. And then they bring you up and up and up and up. If you can continue to provide information on the projects and show up that matter. But
Jeff
if
and I-
you don't have that person, you will never know.
We're hatching how we can get clients to do it when
Great.
it's not regulatory.
Great.
I was going to say, do you have an apprentice program? We could
Thank you so
clone-
much. They have
clone
my
you.
crew. They're out there working
Yeah.
right now.
Can we switch gears just a little bit, touch on water? The considerations now, what's changed in our view of water, and especially in California, since it's occasionally very scarce. But from what I understand, we have quite a bit of water in this state, but it's how it's managed seems to be a challenge. But talk to us about like permeable surfaces, green roofs, the flow of site to a water. I don't know who wants to field that one, but drainage. One of you guys said in our talks, drainage of yesterday is not the drainage of today.
I think I said that.
Okay.
So I'm going to talk about San Francisco specific for a minute. We have a lot of hills, right? And water goes downhill. And it goes downhill, and it basically is hitting all surfaces that it just flows very quickly across all the way downhill. And then when it finally stops, it's also hitting hard surfaces, but it's also hitting a place where the water table is very high, where previously it had been a wetland, and now it's, neighborhoods. And so then the water stops there and raises up and causes systemic flooding in areas that we've all seen under like the Central Freeway, right by Stable Cafe. Stable Cafe, like their flood, do you guys know this is Stable Cafe? They get their floodgates every time it like rains an inch. So we have sort of a responsibility. It's when we think of our individual sites, we are not really conceiving of ourselves as part of an overall water system of the city. So if you're working on the upper sites, your job is to make sure that you can stop as much water as you can on site. And that right now, our city sewer system is intertwined. So environmental water that hits your roof and hits your site is going into the sewer system. So when we have a big rain, that's getting overloaded downhill and causing the sewers to back up. It actually, as it's leaving the city, comes back in and causes flooding, right? So if you're working uphill, you have to make these arguments where possible to add a rainwater tank, even though the answer is, oh, but we can't use that on site. We could do gray water and we could do all of these other things because we don't need that water. We don't need it for laundry or laundry flushing. We're using low flow toilets. We're doing all this. But you kind of need to stop the flow up there. So that's one thing to say. Put rainwater up top, rainwater tanks if you're working up top. If you're working up top on 40 feet of fill on a cliff, don't put rainwater tanks there because the amount of construction to hold them up and to put them into the hillside will far outweigh the 5,000 gallons you just saved, So, yeah, and that does legit come up. We had a project where we were up on Twin Peaks and we were planning on putting rainwater tanks into the hillside, and we thought, because when I actually advised this client, we looked at soils report from a block away, and we thought they were on bedrock, and we're like, hey, it's hit or miss here, but this is 3 houses down. How different could it be? Well, it turns out it can be really different. So their foundation costs change, and they're really expensive, and it was a lot of embodied carbon to get that piers and all those things in there. But the plan had been, when we were building these walls, to use them and put rainwater tanks in there. That plan went away, and we just have gray water. So again, you can have the best laid plans, but you've got to react to what's happening and be realistic about it. So store it up top, let it infiltrate on site, make sure that environmental water tries to stay in the environment, and if we can let that happen and get more of that environmental water out of our sewer system, the better. And then our sewer systems right now have a multi-billion-dollar contract, which you probably know more about, to underground them, to replace them across the city, which is great. They're getting a little bigger and they're going a little lower, but it's still not quite fully accounting for climate change. And so right now, how like in electricity, we have all these microgrids, we actually are going to need to think of water differently too. Because we have drought and then we have flood. We have much bigger variations right now. So if we can take responsibility site by site, we might be able to be changing water patterns, and that might need to happen for the city. And then obviously, if we can do more urban planning things that take it through like Vision Boulevard and do things that kind of change that permeable surface and take down the freeway and daylight creeks and like do all of these other like large infrastructure projects, that too. But lot by lot, we can be doing some things as well.
We are at the time for questions. This is a great panel, right? I mean, let's give them a round of applause. Again, anybody have some questions? We got one in the way back there. We don't have a mic for you, but okay, we're going to give you, but if you want to stand up and shout, we're okay with that too.
Well, I have a card for sure, and I have a few people, but no, there isn't. There isn't, and the title consulting ecologist didn't exist before I made it. So,
The first and only.
Yeah.
no,
Not
there's
only.
other ones. No,
There's your directory right here.
No, but yeah, my name's Josiah Clark. Habitat. I'll give you a card.
And I have a follow-up question.
Uh-huh.
Have you ever done, because you mentioned daylighting a creek, we are co-investors of a 6.8 acre raw lot at Fremont, and there's an unnamed creek, and I noticed there were 1950s culverts that we're probably going to get rid of and want to daylight it.
Uh-huh.
Have you had experience, and what are some lessons learned, some things you're glad you did or wish you were told for somebody like me who's never done it?
Yeah, cool. Well, right here in the Presidio, there was a really, really like one of the coolest urban watershed projects ever done was done by a group called the Urban Watershed Project. And it's a guy named Doug Kern. And it starts up there at Inspiration Point, and then it goes down, and they actually daylighted the creek starting at El Palin, which is the fertility spring. I don't know if you know that. And then it would go in a pipe, but they destroyed the pipe and they daylighted it. And they made it now flow down a kind of studded little rill in this little cool riparian bowl up there at the base of Inspiration Point. And then it goes down and it meets up at, basically they allowed the water to go all the way down to Crissy Field. It goes by the YMCA there, and then over by Thompson's Reach, and then eventually down to Crissy Field, which is to say this whole portion of a watershed. So I have worked with urban watersheds. I have worked with the Presidio on a lot of theirs. I haven't run the machines to destroy to get in there. But yeah, there's certainly a lot of work with that. Okay, one of the big lessons to know is it's like Houdini under there effect, right? You don't really know what's going on underground. And it could very likely be you have lead and you have gas, and it's gonna have to get dealt with. I discovered when I worked at Crissy Field, huge stashed away nasty underground oil things leaching into Crissy Field from the Army Corps of Engineers. And we had all the people coming forward and telling us what it used to be like. But that's to say you don't know what you're gonna find when you start digging, and it might not all be good. But the end result sounds amazing. I mean, there are so many great models of urban watershed things across the country. So, yeah.
There was a question back there, yeah.
Mine was related. I was just curious, since you brought that up, how many creeks there would be in San Francisco to daylight.
A lot.
I know that there's only a few free-flowing creeks now.
Yeah.
And, one of the really, really wild facts I can tell you was from Glen Canyon, which is one of our work sites. Apparently back in, something like the 40s or 50s, you could take, that's the headwaters of Aslayas Creek up there. You could take 2 canoes side by side and bring them down
No kidding.
Glen Canyon.
Wow.
That's how wide it used to be. There's Lobos Creek, is basically a free-flowing creek. There's a few. I mean, put them in dozens.
Yeah.
Right here in front.
So there is through the Society of Ecological Restoration, there is a list of certified ecological, I think it's SER, CER, something like that. I can share that with you. I had a question about measuring soil before a project starts and after a project ends, and if you guys could talk about, I'm sure you guys have been a part of that, and
You would think, right? The first time that I started to do that was actually on our farm. So I haven't done that on a job professionally. So I've only done it personally. I don't know about you.
I did it on my personal residence because I wanted to do a vegetable garden, in the backyard, but it was, as I was doing the construction, it became really clear to me that the soil was already quite contaminated from previous construction efforts. So I had the soil tested, but it wasn't sort of a before and after situation. Lead mostly. That's what I would be looking for. Yeah.
And that's from paint mostly? Or, yeah.
And I guess we're doing it for various reasons because it is still the ranch. We are growing food, and we're doing other it's a regenerative ranch, so we're really looking at the soil, and we're trying to grow things for the practice of architecture. So that might be like it's next week when it rains. We're putting in the winter wheat, by the way, for the straw bale walls. So things like that. So we're doing soil testing there, but our goal is to see if we can test there when we're not under construction there, but our goal is to do continuous testing and to see that if we can be creating a built environment where we're not degrading but we're enhancing it. And that, I actually don't think I've done that professionally, to be quite frank. I think that everywhere that we've built, we've probably degraded things at least for a while and then tried our best to make it better, but I don't know of the actual construction of foundations and the actual work made it better. That's the hope of how we can be changing the practice.
Any other questions?
It sounds like you want baseline information on your soil.
yeah, just what would you look for?
What were and how does it get in there? Yeah, it's either the lead would either get in there. You're looking for things that are going to be absorbed. Are you looking for it for the sake of a garden, a vegetable garden?
No, construction.
Regenerating the land.
Okay. I think that copper is a big one that people test for, I believe. I know definitely lead, and it gets in through both leaded fuel and through paint. People used to just kind of dump their paint. There's
And I should clarify, I'm not talking about toxins, I'm more talking about carbon content.
okay.
You should talk about
there's-
toxins.
There's some guy I saw on Instagram that I was trying to then find the actual information that he said that he was coding all of his foundations with something that allowed the mycelium network to transmit past the foundation that he just cut in. And then I was like, where is the actual information? And it was just I don't know, is this a bogus post? I can't find it. So if that's the kind of stuff, can we make our foundations, can we make our stuff so that we're not disrupting the networks that exist underground? And I tell me, I'll give you my card. Call me when you find something. Oh, awesome. Then tell us.
Well, it kind of comes from working with ecologists, right? I mean, how would you measure soil and say, oh, this is, really good
Okay,
soil?
I think that's an organic matter content. You definitely want a
Organic
pH.
matter,
One of the first things is what's the pH? Is it more neutral? Is it more acidic? Is it more alkaline? And then, if you're talking about growing stuff in it, you're going to want to amend it. But then there's a component of how much of the soil is organic matter versus how much of it is mineral based. And then when you're talking about mineral, are these serpentine soils? Because of course, serpentine soils. I just learned a new vocabulary word, engothic. Is that what it is? I believe it's endathic. Endathic are species of plants that have adapted to toxic soils. So
wow.
things like our serpent, the reason we have so many rare plants in California is they have actually adapted to natural toxins in the soil, right? So it's not like everything in nature is just pure and great organic, the tasty soil, right? I mean, there are whole areas of that are shut down to human habitation or entry because they're so much asbestos, of course, is what's in serpentine, our state mineral. So you would want to know what the basic, I think you would want to know the basic geology of your area, and then you're going to find out whether this is alluvial, is it sedimentary, is it some stream deposit? You're going to want to figure out what the geologic history of the soil is, and then was it a human base? Is there a disturbance that was a human-based disturbance, or is it a natural kind of disturbance that maybe happened a long time ago? And of course, there's the biotic and the abiotic components of your soil, right? The abiotic, and this is stuff that comes into a building site, right? I mean, so something I'm on to say is vocabulary is very important in this. A glossary of terms, whether you're talking about the materials or whether you're talking about the process or whether you're talking about asking for how to make better parks. It's well, do you want diversity? Do you want rarity? Do you want, what are the things you're working with? But getting back to that, it was, the specific, I'm sorry, what were we just talking about?
Can construction and a building make the soil better?
Yeah, so abiotic versus biotic, that's right. So it comes down to what component of the soil is organic and is kind of that carbon, right? Which is, whether we're talking about water or whether we're talking about carbon, we're talking about basically wanting to keep it underground, right? And, what is the ability, some of these loamy soils, that's like compost, right? That's like that organic matter that develops and then stays in the ground and is that kind of holy grail of where we put our carbon, right? And we want it to be underground. And as it dries out, all of that carbon kind of goes back up into the atmosphere again, right? So you want to know kind of the carbon holding potential of your land. And that often has to do with how intact the soil is and what plants grow in it, and how fast the plants grow. I'll give a huge plug to bunch grasses for what it's worth. Bunch grasses, believe it or not, this is one of the major facts. They sequester more carbon than trees.
Really? Wow.
Trees take a very long time to begin sequestering carbon, and then they stop, really plateau in their sequestration of carbon.
Interesting.
What you really want are bunch grasses that grow they pack it in. If you've ever seen those diagrams of the guy holding up the grass with a beard that's 10 times as long as him, that's going down into the ground, because you can pack more dimes in the nickels kind of thing into the ground.
That's
right?
a good plug. How many people in this room have seen the movie Kiss the Ground? Oh, not enough. I would suggest you see that. All this will make sense to you in our entire ecosystem and how we are big players in its destruction and its protection. I'd just like to wrap up and say that California has 4 seasons as we know them: earthquakes, drought, fires, and flood. So with all the sort of coastal erosion that's been going on, how much of that could have been prevented? We see houses now falling into the ocean or close to it, or coming down cliffs. How much of that did we cause, or did we just build on unstable soil from the beginning? Anybody care to mention?
Well, there was a policy when San Francisco was being developed that if you could fill in a wetland, you owned the land. So that was what happened. The wetlands got filled in for railroads, and they were like, awesome, I have a ton of crap I can dump in here, and then we will fill it in, and then we will own it. And then what happened as you were dumping stuff into the wetland, the kind of mission wetlands were called I don't remember, there's some sort of mission death swamp or something we got phrase, but actually what was happening is the tanneries were dumping into the wetlands, the railroads had dumped into the wetlands, and they had claimed the land and made the land so that they now could put stuff on it. There was a horse track, and there's you can see the remnants of it in the city. So we had we kind of took out the mechanism by which the Bay Area would have been filtering out water and toxins and filled it in and made neighborhoods. And they're now the neighborhoods that traditionally flood and are the ones with the highest environmental justice impact where those plants had happened and where things have happened, where the soils are the worst, and where people who have been traditionally, the last talk, you guys were awesome, but when you were talking about Walmart shoppers, I kept being like, you can't this is like the same people that we just did all of everything I just said to. So I do think you were all awesome, but I just needed to say that right now. So how much of this did we make? Well, we made that because our framework was it's ours for the taking. And that goes back to what is our story and what are we talking about and what's ours and what's not and where are we as part of a community and an ecosystem. And if you can change the story of how you think about those things, you don't get to claim land just because you put some crap in it. It's weird.
Well, I think we'll wrap by saying, Josiah, thank you for opening our talk with the notion of noticing. Because what I've learned here today is all three of you are noticers and take very good care in your own disciplines of having us look at a project in a very different way. So I want to thank you all for educating us. This is a lively discussion, and thank you all for coming and joining us.